Homeless black veteran on trial. When judge hears his name, entire courtroom rises. The homeless veteran sat in the defendant's chair, his torn clothes and unwashed appearance drawing disgusted stares from everyone in the courtroom. "State your name for the record," the clerk demanded with barely concealed contempt. The man lifted his head, revealing eyes that had seen too much, and spoke in a voice that carried the weight of forgotten honor. "Marcus Washington, Staff Sergeant, United States Army." No one in that room could have imagined what would happen next. Minutes later, when an elderly general in the back row heard that name, he stood up with trembling hands, his face pale with recognition. That name belonged to the soldier who had carried his dying son through enemy fire, the medic who had saved hundreds of lives in the mountains of Afghanistan, the hero who had been forgotten by the very country he had bled for. What happened when the judge learned the truth would restore faith in justice itself. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead in courtroom 3B, casting harsh shadows across the worn wooden benches. Marcus Washington sat hunched forward on the defendant's bench, his weathered hands clasped tightly together. The orange jumpsuit hung loose on his gaunt frame. A man who had once commanded respect, now reduced to just another case number in the system. Judge Patricia Coleman shuffled through her papers with visible irritation. Another petty theft case. Another homeless defendant who couldn't afford proper representation. She'd seen thousands like him over her 20-year career on the bench. This one had allegedly stolen a sandwich from a downtown convenience store. The store owner insisted on pressing charges, claiming he was tired of these people thinking they can take whatever they want. "Mr. Washington," Judge Coleman began, barely glancing up from her documents, "you're charged with theft in the 3rd degree. How do you plead?" Marcus lifted his head slowly. His eyes, though dulled by exhaustion and defeat, still held traces of the fierce determination that had once made him extraordinary. But nobody in that courtroom could see it. They saw only what they expected to see. Another broken man who had given up on life. The public defender, fresh out of law school and overwhelmed with cases, whispered hurriedly in Marcus's ear, "Just plead guilty. You'll get time served in community service. Fighting this will only make things worse." But Marcus had fought before, in places where the stakes were life and death, not sandwiches and misdemeanor charges. He straightened his shoulders, a ghost of military bearing, breaking through years of defeat. "Not guilty, Your Honor." A collective sigh rippled through the courtroom. Even his own lawyer looked frustrated. But something was about to happen that nobody expected. Something that would transform this routine hearing into a moment that would be remembered for years to come. If you believe that honor doesn't disappear even when everything else is stripped away, hit that like button. Because what you're about to hear will challenge everything you think you know about judging people by their circumstances. The fall from grace. 3 years earlier, Marcus Washington had been a different man entirely. Staff Sergeant Marcus Washington, to be precise. A decorated Army medic with 2 tours in Afghanistan and a chest full of ribbons that told the story of a life dedicated to saving others. His apartment in Oakland had been modest but clean, filled with commendations and photographs of the young soldiers whose lives he'd preserved in the unforgiving terrain of Kandahar province. But war leaves marks that don't show up in dress uniforms. The nightmares came first. Violent dreams where he relived every casualty he couldn't save. Every close call that left him wondering why he survived when better men didn't. The VA prescribed pills that dulled the screaming in his head, but left him feeling like a stranger in his own skin. Then came the injury that ended everything. An IED explosion during his final deployment had left shrapnel in his back, and a traumatic brain injury that the military doctors said would improve with time. Time, it turned out, was not the healer they promised. The headaches grew worse, his balance deteriorated, and simple tasks became monumental challenges. The Army processed his discharge with bureaucratic efficiency, 30% disability rating, a monthly check that barely covered rent, a stack of paperwork promising benefits that seemed to vanish into an endless maze of departments and waiting lists. Marcus had saved countless lives in the desert, but the system he'd served couldn't seem to save his. His girlfriend Sandra tried to understand. She really did. But watching the man she loved transform into someone she barely recognized, Someone who flinched at car backfires and couldn't sleep through the night proved too much. She moved out on a Tuesday morning while Marcus was at another VA appointment that led nowhere. "I can't watch you disappear," she whispered, her suitcase already packed. "Get help, Marcus." Real help. But help was a phantom. The VA counselors were overworked and understaffed. The promised job training programs had waiting lists that stretched for months. His disability checks were delayed, then reduced after a reassessment that seemed designed to save money rather than serve veterans. Marcus found himself caught in a bureaucratic web where every solution required 6 different forms and approval from departments that never seemed to communicate with each other. The eviction notice came on a Friday. 3 months behind on rent, with no family to call and no friends who understood what he was going through. Marcus packed what he could carry into a worn Army duffel bag, the same one that had traveled with him through 2 war zones, and walked out into the Oakland streets. The first few nights he slept in his car. Then the car was repossessed. Then the streets became home, and home became a concept that belonged to his past life. The man who had once carried wounded soldiers to safety now carried everything he owned in a shopping cart with a broken wheel. Winter came early that year. Marcus found shelter where he could, under overpasses, in doorways, occasionally in the warming centers that opened when temperatures dropped below freezing. His clothes grew dirty and torn. His beard became unkempt. The proud bearing that had once distinguished him melted away under the constant stress of survival. People looked through him now. The same citizens he had sworn to protect crossed the street to avoid him. Store owners watched him with suspicious eyes. Police officers told him to move along from public spaces where he had every right to exist. The invisible man had become literally invisible, not because of any superpower, but because society had collectively decided he no longer mattered. The convenience store incident happened on a Tuesday morning in November. Marcus hadn't eaten in 2 days. His disability check was delayed again, lost in another bureaucratic shuffle that would take weeks to resolve. The winter cold had settled into his bones, and the shrapnel in his back ached with every movement. He walked into Jerry's Corner Market with the last $3 in his pocket, hoping to buy something, anything to quiet the gnawing hunger in his stomach. But when he reached the counter, his addled brain confused him. The head injury that the VA insisted was minor made simple tasks like counting money sometimes impossible. He put down the sandwich, patted his pockets, and walked out, forgetting in that moment of confusion that he hadn't paid. Jerry Kowalski, the store owner, had been robbed twice in the past year. He was tired of it. Tired of the homeless population that he felt was ruining his neighborhood. When he saw Marcus walk out with the sandwich, he didn't see a confused veteran struggling with brain trauma. He saw a thief who thought he could take whatever he wanted. "Stop right there," Jerry shouted, following Marcus onto the sidewalk. "You didn't pay for that." Marcus turned, genuinely confused. The sandwich was still in his hand. For a moment, he couldn't remember picking it up. The fog in his brain that sometimes descended without warning had taken hold again. I was going to," Marcus began, but the words wouldn't come. The more he tried to explain, the more guilty he sounded. Jerry had already called the police. Within minutes, Marcus was in handcuffs, his worn duffel bag searched for additional stolen merchandise. The officers were professional but unsympathetic. They'd arrested Jerry's thief dozens of times, homeless individuals whose desperation sometimes led to petty crimes. "Sandwich bandit," one of the officers joked to his partner as they drove Marcus to the county jail. It was the kind of dark humor that cops used to cope with the endless parade of human misery they encountered daily. But Marcus wasn't laughing. He was thinking about how far he'd fallen from the man who had once been trusted with the lives of America's finest soldiers. The public defender assigned to his case was Rebecca Torres, a well-meaning recent graduate who was already handling 47 other cases. She had 15 minutes to review Marcus's file before their first meeting in the jail's consultation room. "Mr. Washington," she said, reading from her notes, "this is pretty straightforward. It's your first offense, and it's just a sandwich. The prosecutor will probably offer a plea deal, time served plus community service. I'd recommend taking it." Marcus wanted to tell her about the Purple Heart gathering dust in a storage unit he could no longer afford. He wanted to explain about the soldiers he'd saved and the country he'd served. He wanted her to understand that he wasn't a career criminal, just a broken man trying to survive in a system that had forgotten him. But the words wouldn't come. The TBI made it hard to organize his thoughts sometimes, especially when he was stressed. So he just nodded and agreed to think about the plea deal. That night, lying on the thin mattress in his cell, Marcus stared at the ceiling and wondered if this was how his story would end. Not with the honor he'd once imagined, but with a whimper. Another forgotten veteran lost in the cracks of a society that thanked him for his service with words, but abandoned him with actions. He had no way of knowing that in just a few days, everything would change. That the courtroom he was dreading would become the place where his true story was finally told. That the judge who saw him as just another case number was about to discover exactly who Marcus Washington really was. The moment of truth, Judge Patricia Coleman had presided over thousands of cases during her 2 decades on the bench, but something about this particular morning felt different. Maybe it was the way the defendant carried himself. There was something in his posture that didn't quite match his circumstances. Or maybe it was just another long day in a career, filled with long days. Marcus Washington stood as his name was called, the orange jumpsuit hanging loose on his frame. His public defender, Rebecca Torres, shuffled nervously through her files. The courtroom was nearly empty except for a few court reporters, a bailiff, and an elderly man in the back row who had been sitting quietly through several cases. "Mr. Washington," Judge Coleman began, "you're charged with theft in the 3rd degree. The prosecution alleges that you took a sandwich valued at $4.99 from Jerry's Corner Market without payment. How do you plead?" Marcus looked up at the judge, and for a moment their eyes met. Judge Coleman felt an odd flutter of recognition, though she couldn't place why. Something about his eyes seemed familiar, not the defeated look she expected, but something deeper, something that reminded her of, "Not guilty, Your Honor," Marcus said quietly. Rebecca Torres leaned over to whisper urgently in his ear, "Marcus, we discussed this. The plea deal is—" "I understand, ma'am," Marcus interrupted gently, "but I'm not guilty. I was confused. I have a brain injury from my service. Sometimes I forget things." Judge Coleman raised an eyebrow. "Your service, Mr. Washington?" "Army, Your Honor. Staff Sergeant Marcus Washington. 2 tours in Afghanistan." The elderly man in the back row suddenly sat up straighter, his weathered face showing the first sign of interest since he had entered the courtroom. He leaned forward, squinting at the defendant. Judge Coleman felt that flutter of recognition again, stronger this time. Marcus Washington. The name seemed to echo in her mind, connected to something important, something she couldn't quite grasp. "Mr. Washington," she said slowly, "what unit did you serve with?" 3rd Infantry Division, Your Honor. 1st Brigade Combat Team. I was a medic with the 2nd Battalion, 7th Infantry Regiment." The elderly man in the back row suddenly stood up, his face pale. His hand went to his chest, where a small American flag pin was attached to his suit jacket. "Judge Coleman," the man called out, his voice shaking, "may I approach the bench?" Judge Coleman looked annoyed at the interruption. "Sir, this is highly irregular. Please remain seated." But the man was already walking forward, his steps unsteady but determined. "Your Honor, I apologize, but this is important. Very important." The bailiff moved to intercept him, but Judge Coleman held up a hand. Something in the man's voice, the urgency, the emotion, made her pause. "What is your name, sir?" she asked. "General Robert Hayes, retired. United States Army." The old man's voice was stronger now, carrying the authority of decades of command. "And if this man is who I think he is, then this court needs to know something." Marcus looked up sharply at the name. "General Hayes?" His voice was barely a whisper. The 2 men looked at each other across the courtroom, and suddenly the years fell away. General Hayes saw not the broken homeless man in an orange jumpsuit, but the young medic who had saved his son's life in a dusty medical tent outside Kandahar. "My God," General Hayes breathed. "Marcus Washington, the Angel of Kandahar." Judge Coleman felt the pieces clicking into place. The Angel of Kandahar. She'd heard that name before years ago, in news reports about a medic who had performed extraordinary acts of heroism during some of the heaviest fighting in Afghanistan. But the details were fuzzy, overshadowed by the constant stream of war news that had dominated the media for so many years. "General," she said carefully, "perhaps you could explain to the court what you mean." General Hayes straightened to his full height, and suddenly the courtroom felt different, charged with an energy that hadn't been there moments before. Even the bailiff was standing at attention without realizing it. "Your Honor," General Hayes began, his voice carrying the weight of absolute conviction, "the man standing before you is not just any veteran. Staff Sergeant Marcus Washington is one of the most decorated medics in the history of the United States Army. He saved over 200 lives during his deployments, often under direct enemy fire." Marcus was shaking his head, trying to shrink back into invisibility. "General, please." "No, son," General Hayes said firmly. "These people need to know who you are. They need to know what you've done." Judge Coleman leaned forward. "General Hayes, while I appreciate your testimony, this court is here to address a specific charge." "Judge Coleman," General Hayes interrupted, his voice rising with passion, "my son is alive today because of this man. Lieutenant Colonel David Hayes was dying in a medical tent when Staff Sergeant Washington performed emergency surgery under mortar fire. For 6 hours, he kept my boy alive while the base was under attack." The courtroom had gone completely silent. Even the court reporter had stopped typing, caught up in the unfolding drama. Marcus closed his eyes, and suddenly he was back there. The acrid smell of smoke and blood, the sound of incoming mortars, the weight of David Hayes' life in his hands as he worked frantically to stop the bleeding from shrapnel wounds that had nearly severed the young officer's femoral artery. "The medevac couldn't land," General Hayes continued, his voice breaking slightly. "The LZ was too hot, so Marcus carried my son, carried him half a mile to the secondary landing zone while taking fire from insurgents in the hills. Half a mile, Your Honor, with a man on his back and bullets flying around them." Rebecca Torres was staring at her client with her mouth open. This was not the man she'd met in the jail consultation room. This was not the simple theft case she'd been expecting to plea out in 5 minutes. Judge Coleman felt something she hadn't experienced in years on the bench: genuine awe. "Mr. Washington, is this true?" Marcus opened his eyes, and for a moment, the fog of defeat and confusion lifted. For just a moment, he was Staff Sergeant Washington again, the man who had never left a soldier behind, who had earned the trust and respect of everyone who served with him. "I was just doing my job, Your Honor," he said quietly. "Just doing your job?" General Hayes laughed, but there was no humor in it, only wonder and gratitude. "Son, you performed battlefield surgery with nothing but basic supplies while mortars were landing 50 meters away. You carried a wounded soldier through a firefight because you refused to let him die on foreign soil. That's not just doing your job. That's heroism of the highest order." The elderly general turned to address the courtroom, though it was nearly empty. His voice carried the authority of someone who had commanded thousands of soldiers, who had seen courage in its purest form. The citation for his Silver Star reads, "For gallantry in action against an enemy of the United States." But that doesn't begin to describe what this man did. He saved my son's life, and he saved the lives of dozens of other soldiers who would have died without his skill and courage. Judge Coleman was struggling to process what she was hearing. The broken man standing before her, the homeless defendant accused of stealing a sandwich, was a decorated war hero who had risked his life repeatedly to save others. "Mr. Washington," she said slowly, "why didn't your attorney mention your military service?" Rebecca Torres found her voice. "Your Honor, he never told me. The details weren't in his file." Marcus shrugged, a gesture that somehow managed to convey years of disappointment and bureaucratic failures. "It doesn't seem to matter much anymore, Your Honor. The VA has all the records, but—" He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence that would have explained how the system had failed him so completely. General Hayes stepped closer to the defendant's table. "Marcus, what happened to you? After you were discharged, what happened?" For the first time since entering the courtroom, Marcus Washington looked directly at the judge, and she could see the full weight of his struggle in his eyes. "I fell through the cracks, Your Honor," he said simply. "The same cracks that a lot of us fall through." The untold story. Judge Coleman called for a 30-minute recess, but instead of leaving the bench, she remained seated, staring at the man who had just been revealed as one of America's most decorated soldiers. The courtroom buzzed with quiet conversation as word began to spread about what was happening. General Hayes approached the defendant's table, where Marcus sat with his head in his hands. Rebecca Torres was frantically making phone calls, trying to verify the military records she should have accessed weeks ago. "Marcus," General Hayes said gently, sitting down beside him, "tell me what happened. Tell me how you ended up here." Marcus looked up at the man whose son he had saved 7 years earlier. General Hayes had aged. His hair was completely white now, and deep lines etched his face. But his eyes still held the same intensity that had made him a respected leader. "It's a long story, General," Marcus said quietly. "I have time, son, and I think this court needs to hear it." Judge Coleman leaned forward from the bench. "Mr. Washington, I'm inclined to agree. Your situation appears to be far more complex than initially presented." Marcus took a deep breath, organizing his thoughts as best he could, despite the fog that sometimes clouded his thinking. "After I was discharged, I tried to adjust, really tried. But the nightmares, the headaches from the TBI, it was like living in someone else's body." He paused, looking around the courtroom that had become an unlikely confessional. "The VA rated my disability at 30%, said my brain injury was mild and would improve with time. But it didn't improve, Your Honor. It got worse. I couldn't hold a job because I'd forget things, lose focus. Simple tasks became impossible some days." General Hayes nodded grimly. He'd seen too many soldiers struggle with similar invisible wounds. "I applied for help, job training, counseling, increase in benefits. But every program had waiting lists. Every department sent me to another department. I spent more time in VA offices than I had in combat zones and got about the same results." Rebecca Torres finished her phone call and hurried back to the table. "Your Honor, I've just confirmed with the Department of Defense. Staff Sergeant Washington's record is extraordinary. Silver Star, Bronze Star with V device, Purple Heart, Combat Medical Badge with Star. The list goes on." Judge Coleman shook her head in disbelief. "Mr. Washington, with decorations like that, surely there were veterans organizations, military networks that could have helped." Marcus's laugh was bitter. "You'd think so, Your Honor. But a lot of those organizations help the veterans who are already doing well. The ones who successfully transitioned, got good jobs, have stable housing. When you're actually homeless, when you look like—" he gestured to his appearance. "Well, it's easier to help the veterans who clean up nice for fundraising photos." The truth of that statement hung in the air like an accusation against everyone who had ever claimed to support veterans while walking past the homeless ones on the street. General Hayes cleared his throat. "Marcus, what about David? My son, he's a colonel now, stationed at the Pentagon. He would have helped if he'd known. I didn't want charity, General. I wanted to earn my way back. I wanted the system that I served to work the way it's supposed to work." Marcus's voice carried the frustration of years of bureaucratic failures. "But every month it seemed like there was a new hoop to jump through, a new form to fill out, a new reason why my benefits were delayed or reduced." Rebecca Torres was taking notes frantically, finally understanding the complexity of her client's situation. "Your Honor, this appears to be a case where multiple systems failed simultaneously: medical, bureaucratic, and social." Judge Coleman nodded. "Mr. Washington, how did you end up on the streets?" "My girlfriend left because she couldn't handle what I'd become. Can't blame her. I barely recognized myself. My disability checks were delayed for 3 months due to a clerical error. Got evicted, lost my car, and suddenly I was carrying everything I owned in the same duffel bag I'd used in Afghanistan." The parallel was not lost on anyone in the courtroom. The same bag that had carried supplies to save lives in a war zone now carried the meager possessions of a homeless man. "The first few months on the street were the hardest," Marcus continued. "You learn quickly that people don't see you anymore. They look through you, around you, but never at you. The same people who would thank me for my service if they saw me in uniform would cross the street to avoid me when I was dirty and desperate." General Hayes was visibly struggling with emotion. "Son, if I had known—" "You couldn't have known, General. That's part of the problem. We're invisible until something like this happens." Marcus gestured around the courtroom. Until there's a crisis that forces people to see us. Judge Coleman was beginning to understand the full scope of what she was witnessing. Mr. Washington, what about the incident at the convenience store? Can you tell me what happened? Marcus rubbed his temples where a headache was building, the kind that had plagued him since the IED explosion that had effectively ended his military career. I hadn't eaten in 2 days, Your Honor. My disability check was delayed again. Some new review process they'd implemented. I went into Jerry's store with $3, hoping to buy something small. But when I got to the counter, he paused, struggling with the memory. The TBI affects my short-term memory sometimes, especially when I'm stressed or hungry. I picked up the sandwich, went to pay, got confused about the money, and walked out. I honestly don't remember taking it without paying. When Mr. Kowalski confronted me, I was genuinely confused about what had happened. Rebecca Torres looked up from her notes. Your Honor, traumatic brain injury can cause exactly these kinds of episodes. Temporary confusion, memory gaps, difficulty processing complex situations. General Hayes stood up abruptly, his face flushed with anger. Not at Marcus, but at the system that had failed him so completely. Judge Coleman, he said, his voice carrying the authority of his rank, this man saved my son's life. He saved hundreds of lives. He served his country with distinction and honor, and we have failed him in every way possible. The general turned to face Marcus directly. Son, I'm sorry. I'm sorry that the country you served abandoned you. I'm sorry that the system we trusted to take care of our veterans let you fall through the cracks. I'm sorry that you've been living on the streets while bureaucrats shuffle papers and politicians make speeches about supporting our troops. Marcus was fighting back tears, the first real emotion he'd shown since entering the courtroom. I never wanted to be a charity case, General. I just wanted to be treated fairly. I wanted the help I was promised when I took the oath to serve. Judge Coleman stood up from the bench, an unprecedented move that caused everyone in the courtroom to fall silent. Mr. Washington, she said, her voice carrying a weight it hadn't held at the beginning of the session, I need to ask you something, and I want you to be completely honest with me. Marcus looked up, meeting her eyes directly for the first time. If the charges against you are dismissed, if you're given the help and support you need, what do you want to do with your life? For a moment, the broken homeless man disappeared, and Staff Sergeant Marcus Washington stood in his place. I want to help other veterans, Your Honor. I want to make sure that what happened to me doesn't happen to anyone else. I want to serve again, in whatever way I can. It was at that moment that Judge Coleman realized she wasn't just presiding over a petty theft case. She was witnessing the resurrection of a hero. The revelation Judge Coleman had seen enough in her, 20 years on the bench, to recognize a pivotal moment when it arrived. This was no longer about a stolen sandwich or even about the failure of various systems. This was about honor, sacrifice, and the debt that society owed to those who had served. General Hayes, she said, you mentioned that Staff Sergeant Washington was known as the Angel of Kandahar. I'd like to hear more about that. The elderly general straightened, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of absolute authority and deep personal gratitude. Your Honor, during the spring of 2018, the forward operating base where Marcus was stationed came under sustained attack for 6 days. It was one of the worst sieges of the entire Afghan conflict. The enemy had us surrounded, and casualties were mounting faster than the medical staff could handle. Marcus closed his eyes, and suddenly he was back there. The constant sound of incoming fire, the smell of cordite and blood, the endless stream of wounded soldiers who trusted him to keep them alive. On the 3rd day of the siege, General Hayes continued, the main medical facility took a direct hit from a mortar round. 2 doctors were killed, and most of the surgical equipment was destroyed. Marcus was the only medic left with any real surgical experience. Rebecca Torres was scribbling notes, finally beginning to understand the magnitude of her client's background. He set up a makeshift surgical unit in a supply tent, using whatever equipment he could salvage. For 3 days and nights, he performed surgery after surgery while the base was under constant attack. He didn't sleep, barely ate, and saved the lives of 47 soldiers who would have died without immediate surgical intervention. Judge Coleman felt a chill run down her spine. Mr. Washington, is this accurate? Marcus nodded slowly. We couldn't evacuate anyone, Your Honor. The LZ was too hot, and the roads were blocked. It was operate or let them die. But that's not why they called him the Angel of Kandahar, General Hayes said, his voice growing stronger. Tell her about Captain Rodriguez, Marcus. Marcus shook his head. General, I don't think... No, son. She needs to know. Everyone needs to know. General Hayes turned back to Judge Coleman. Captain Maria Rodriguez was a helicopter pilot whose Black Hawk was shot down about 2 kilometers from the base. She was badly injured, broken back, internal bleeding, and trapped in hostile territory with 3 other crew members. The courtroom had grown so quiet that the hum of the fluorescent lights seemed loud. The rescue mission was deemed too dangerous. The area was swarming with enemy fighters, and we'd already lost 2 helicopters trying to extract casualties. Command made the decision to wait for air support that might not come for hours. Marcus was gripping the edge of the table, his knuckles white. Marcus disagreed with that decision, General Hayes continued. He grabbed a medical kit and headed for the perimeter. When the commanding officer ordered him to stand down, Marcus said something I'll never forget. Sir, I didn't take an oath to save lives only when it was convenient. Judge Coleman leaned forward. What happened? He went anyway, General Hayes said simply. He slipped out of the base during a lull in the fighting and made his way to the crash site, found Captain Rodriguez and her crew pinned down by sniper fire. 2 of the crew members were already dead, and Rodriguez was fading fast. Marcus was transported back to that moment, crawling through the dust and debris, the sound of bullets snapping overhead, the desperate certainty that he was the only chance those soldiers had. He spent 4 hours pinned down at that crash site, keeping Captain Rodriguez alive while insurgents tried to overrun their position. When ammunition ran low, he used grenades from the dead crew members to keep the enemy at bay. When those ran out, he used his sidearm. When that ran out, General Hayes paused, overcome by emotion. When that ran out, he fixed bayonet and prepared to make a final stand. That's when the air support finally arrived and was able to clear the area for extraction. Rebecca Torres looked up from her notes. What happened to Captain Rodriguez? She made a full recovery, General Hayes said. She's a major now, stationed at Fort Campbell. She has 3 children who wouldn't exist if Marcus Washington had followed orders instead of following his conscience. Judge Coleman was struggling to process what she was hearing. The homeless man in an orange jumpsuit had risked his life repeatedly to save others, often in defiance of direct orders. There are 43 other stories like that one, General Hayes continued. 43 documented cases where Marcus Washington went above and beyond the call of duty to save lives. He was recommended for the Medal of Honor 3 times, but bureaucratic delays in changing command structures meant the paperwork got lost in the shuffle. Marcus finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. I never did it for medals, General. I did it because it was right. I know, son. That's exactly why you deserved them. Judge Coleman stood up from the bench again, her mind racing. She was looking at a man who embodied everything that was noble about military service, who had sacrificed repeatedly for others, and who had been failed by the very society he had sworn to protect. Mr. Washington, she said, I have one more question for you. Marcus looked up, meeting her eyes with a steadiness that hadn't been there when the hearing began. If you could speak to every person who has walked past you on the street, who has seen you as just another homeless veteran and looked the other way, what would you tell them? Marcus was quiet for a long moment, considering the question. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of years of invisibility and pain, but also the unshakable dignity that no amount of hardship had been able to destroy. I would tell them that every person they pass on the street has a story, that every homeless veteran was once someone's son, someone's protector, someone who raised their right hand and swore to defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. His voice grew stronger as he continued. I would tell them that we didn't choose to be broken. We chose to serve, and service broke us in ways that don't always show up in medical exams or disability ratings. And I would tell them that we're still the same people who would run toward danger to save their lives if the situation called for it. The courtroom was absolutely silent. But mostly, Marcus concluded, I would tell them that we just want the chance to serve again, in whatever way we can. We want to matter. We want to be seen as human beings instead of problems to be solved or inconveniences to be avoided. Judge Coleman nodded slowly, and when she spoke, her voice carried a gravity that made it clear something important was about to happen. Mr. Washington, I want you to stand up. Marcus stood, confused but compliant. General Hayes, would you please join Mr. Washington? The elderly general moved to stand beside Marcus, his bearing suddenly military despite his civilian clothes. Judge Coleman looked out at the nearly empty courtroom, then at the bailiff, the court reporter, and Rebecca Torres. What you are witnessing, she said, her voice carrying beyond the walls of courtroom 3B, is not just the dismissal of charges against an innocent man. You are witnessing the acknowledgement of a debt that can never be fully repaid. She turned to face Marcus directly. Staff Sergeant Marcus Washington, this court recognizes not only that you are innocent of the charges brought against you, but that those charges represent a profound failure of the systems that should have supported you. The United States Army may have discharged you, but your service to this nation never ended. The standing ovation, what happened next, would be talked about in legal circles for years to come. Judge Coleman, abandoning all protocol, stepped down from the bench and walked over to where Marcus Washington stood. Staff Sergeant, she said, extending her hand, it is an honor to meet you. Marcus, confused and overwhelmed, shook her hand. Your Honor, I don't understand. You will, she said simply. Then she turned to address the courtroom, raising her voice so it would carry. Bailiff, please ask the court officers to step into the hallway and request that anyone available come into this courtroom immediately. Tell them that Judge Coleman needs all available personnel for an important proceeding. The bailiff, confused but obedient, stepped out into the hallway. Within minutes, people began filing into the courtroom. Other judges between cases, attorneys waiting for their hearings, court clerks, security personnel, and several members of the public who had been waiting in the hallway. Word spread quickly through the courthouse that something extraordinary was happening in courtroom 3B. A local news reporter who had been covering another case slipped in and began recording on her phone. When about 30 people had gathered, Judge Coleman returned to the bench but remained standing. Ladies and gentlemen, she announced, you are about to witness something that should have happened years ago. Mr. Washington, would you please state your full name and rank for the court? Marcus looked around at the gathering crowd, confused but beginning to understand that something significant was taking place. Staff Sergeant Marcus Washington, United States Army, retired, Your Honor. Judge Coleman nodded. General Hayes, would you please tell this assembly who Staff Sergeant Washington is? General Hayes stepped forward, and when he spoke, his voice carried the authority of decades of military leadership. This man, he said, gesturing toward Marcus, is one of the most decorated soldiers of his generation. He saved over 200 lives during his service in Afghanistan. He was awarded the Silver Star, the Bronze Star with V device, the Purple Heart, and numerous other commendations for valor under fire. The murmur that ran through the gathered crowd was audible. More importantly, General Hayes continued, he saved my son's life. Colonel David Hayes is alive.